Great. Okay. Thanks, Elisa. Hi, everyone. My name is Emla Fitzsimons, and I'll spend the next 20 minutes or so talking about the Millennium Cohort Study. And at the end, I will also show a few slides that Elisa and I put together showing how to access the data through the UKDS as well, that I know some of the queries were in relation to. So, and then there'll be time for questions at the end. So let me just briefly start off by giving a bit of background. So I'm based at the Centre for Longitudinal Studies, which is at the UCL Institute of Education, and we run 4 cohort studies here at CLS. So we run the National Child Development Study, which follows a cohort of people born in a week in 1958, and that covers Great Britain. The British Birth Cohort Study, following a sample of people born in a particular week in 1970. And again, that covers Great Britain. Next Steps, which is an England-only study following, initially run by the Department for Education and following a group of people born around 89-90. And then the Millennium Cohort Study, which is the study that I direct, which follows around 19,000 children born right across the UK in 2000 to 2002. So it also includes Northern Ireland, unlike the earlier ones. It's also, so these studies are nationally representative studies. So both the Millennium Cohort Study and Next Steps contain oversamples of ethnic minorities. And today we're going to focus on the Millennium Cohort Study as part of this webinar. The first part of the talk today will be describing in a little bit more detail how it did that. And then I'll talk about the study a little bit more generally and the type of information it contains and the type of research that's been done so far around ethnicity, with potential to do a lot more. So let me move on. Okay. So the MCS population upon which the sample was drawn includes all children born between the 1st of November 2000 and the 31st of August 2001 in England and Wales, and slightly different birth dates in Scotland and Northern Ireland, covering end of November 2000 to very early 2002. And it covers children who were alive and living in the UK at age 9 months and eligible to receive child benefit at that age. And at that time in the UK, child benefit was a universal benefit, unlike now. So it's people born in that period and who were living here in the UK at age 9 months. So in terms of who it includes and who it doesn't include, so it includes children living in non-household situations in principle, so for instance in women's refugees, hostels, hospitals and so on. However, in practice, we don't have any children from those backgrounds. It also includes children not born in the UK, but who were established as resident in the UK by age 9 months. And there are around 500 of members fall into that category. It excludes children who died before age 9 months. It excludes UK-born children who emigrated from the UK before 9 months. And it also excludes children who weren't established as resident in the UK at age 9 months. So, for instance, children of foreign diplomats, asylum seekers, and so on. So, as I mentioned earlier, the MCS sample was purposefully designed to oversample families from ethnic minorities group. And the reason for this is it was in order to provide sufficient samples of the UK's main ethnic minority groups to allow analysts to carry out research by ethnic identity. And how did it do this? Well, first of all, as part of the sampling, the population was first stratified by country, so into the 4 countries, England, Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland. Then within each of these 4 countries, there was further stratification that took place. So in England only, ethnic minority stratum were identified, and they were defined as areas in which, according to the 1991 census, had an ethnic minority indicator of at least 30%. Or in other words, at least 30% of their total population fell into the 2 categories, Black or Asian. So that was done in England only, and the reason for that is because that's where the majority of ethnic minorities were living at that point. There was further stratification within countries. There was a disadvantaged stratum, so children living in wards which fell into the upper quartile of the ward-based child poverty index, and then an advantaged stratum, which were children living in other wards other than those falling into stratum 1 or 2. So that's a relative term, relatively advantaged stratum. So each country, England, Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland had a disadvantaged stratum, had an advantaged stratum, and then England also had an ethnic minority stratum as well. The other countries didn't have that. So that was the first step. After that, the primary sampling unit upon which the sample was drawn was the electoral ward. And within wards, within these stratum, the aim was to recruit all children born within the eligible period. So the clusters were chosen, the clusters being the wards, and within clusters, everyone was eligible as long as they were born within that particular time frame I mentioned earlier. So that resulted in a total of 398 wards or clusters. 200 of these were in England, and of these 219 of those clusters were from the ethnic minority stratum. So they overrepresented people from ethnic minority backgrounds. And this figure of 19 was calculated in order to provide a sufficient sample size, a sufficiently big N, for ethnic minority subsample analysis. And it took into account things like expected response rates within wards, taking into account expected attrition over time and so on. So that was how the oversampling was done in terms of the ethnic minority backgrounds. Yeah, I think that's all I wanted to say on that one. Yeah, okay. In terms of what the sample looks like at baseline regarding ethnicity, this table just shows the proportion falling into the main ethnic groups. So you'll see that the oversampling resulted in around 18% of the baseline sample being non-white, and the breakdown is shown on the table that you can see in front of you. And that compares to around 10% for the UK as a whole, according to the census at that particular time. So it did result in a larger proportion of ethnic minority participants than one would expect due to the oversampling. So I think that gives you just the background as to how the ethnic minority oversample was done. I'll now talk a little bit about the survey itself and the type of information we collect and when we collect it and when we have collected it so far. So this timeline that's gone slightly, sorry, the formatting has gone a little bit funny, but this basically shows you the ages at which we have collected data. So unlike the Understanding Society, which Alicia spoke about, we're a birth cohort study and we follow individuals from birth throughout the life course. So the first time we interviewed families, parents and so on was at age 9 months. And we've had surveys at ages 3, 5, 7, 11, 14 and 17 since. And the age 17 is currently in the field and is wrapping up quite soon. So data should be available in early 2020 from that one. And what we do at each survey, we interview both resident parents, so mother and father if he's resident in the household, and if not, the partner of the mother who's resident in the household. And we also interview the cohort member, so the main person that we're going to be following through life. And at each sweep, we have conducted a very complete and long and extensive interview with resident parents, and they've also been doing self-completion questionnaires as well at all the sweeps, and that's indicated by the grey horizontal bar that you can see. With the cohort member, we have been collecting data directly from them in terms of questionnaire content from age 7. So they've been filling in their own questionnaires, and we've got four of those to date at ages 7, 11, 14, 17. From the age of 3, we've been measuring their height and weight. So we've got accurate measures of body mass index from very, very young ages for cohort members. We also have been carrying out cognitive assessments with the cohort members from the age of 3 as well. So we've very comprehensive data on things like numeracy, literacy from cohort members at several sweeps. And then at different sweeps, we've also got other types of sources of data. So for instance, at ages 7 and 14, the cohort members wore activity monitors to measure their physical activity and sedentary behavior. At age 14, they also completed quite detailed time use records over 2 representative 24-hour periods, a weekend and a weekday. And at age 14, we also collected saliva from the cohort members and the parents, both biological parents, if present in the household. And that data are being genotyped at present and should be available in this summer. We also have collected consent to link several administrative records of the cohort members and parents. So for instance, we have consent to link administrative health records to age 14, and we're just updating those to get other records from 14 onwards at the age 17 sweep. We also have consent to link education records to age 16, and again, we're just updating that to cover the post-16 period. And we have linked in NPD records for this cohort as well, and we're about to update that with the GCSE results that we're planning to deposit in the next few weeks. And we've also obtained consent to link parents' economic records, which we're in the process of doing at present as well. So we have various consents to link administrative sources as well, as Alita also explained for Understanding Society. In terms of a very broad overview of the topics that are covered as part of the survey, so regarding ethnicity and what might be relevant to those of you who want to study that topic more, we do know in terms of origin, we know their grandparents' country of birth, we know their mother and father's country of birth, and we know the year their mother and father moved to the UK, where relevant, if they weren't born here. In terms of parental information, as mentioned already, we have very detailed data at every survey from both the mother and the resident father or the partner of the mother. So for instance, covering topics such as employment, economic circumstances, education, housing, physical and mental health, language spoken at home, religion, parenting, identity, relationship quality. So lots and lots of areas that you can imagine in several different ways would be very, very relevant to study in terms of how they may vary by ethnicity and so on. And from the cohort member, as mentioned already, we have interviews with cohort members since the age of 7, and that's been sort of increasingly intensive as time goes on, and we're collecting more and more data from them directly. So for instance, at age 14, this gives you an overview of the young person questionnaire content. So we've collected, I think it was about a 40-minute self-completion questionnaire at age 14. We've got lots of data around their views and values, so attitudes to wrongdoing, consumerism, gender roles, and so on. You can see it all there on the slide, risky behaviors and so on and so forth. So very detailed information, and then we can compare how that varies by lots of different background characteristics, including by ethnic background, and the sample sizes are large enough and robust enough to allow us to do that. Just briefly, in terms of the analysis and how one might deal with the sample design, I've just got a couple of slides which might be useful, hopefully, for reference. Because, as I mentioned already, because there was oversampling of ethnic minority groups, there was also oversampling of people from living in disadvantaged areas. The analysis needs to take this into account. So weights should be applied to any analysis in order to restore the sample to its nationally representative sort of feature of it. So in particular, the stratification and clustering sample design features, we need to take account for that, because if we don't, the standard errors will likely be underestimated and our significance tests will be invalid. And there are variables in the data set that allow the researcher to straightforwardly incorporate this into analysis. So the stratification variable is called PT type 2. There are 9 different strata. If you recall the earlier slide where there were 4 countries times 2 strata, and then England had the additional ethnic minority strata. There's also a clustering variable that needs to be used in the weighting analysis. So that's one element of weighting. And the other element of weighting is it's important to account for attrition and non-response. So for instance, this slide shows you the productive sample over time from age 9 months to age 14 years. So starting off with just over 18,500, we can see that by age 14, the sample is just under 12,000. So there is attrition, there is non-response, and it's really important to adjust the analysis for this and to weight appropriately. So the 2 things are important, the sampling design and also attrition. And here's an example of code that one would use to do this. So for instance, if you're looking at MCS 6, the age 14 sweep, and this is a piece of Stata code, but basically this shows you how you would set up the data to account for the oversampling and also attrition. So you can see that you've got the electoral ward ID here. Here you've got the stratum ID there, so you need to tell Stata or tell whatever program you're using that that's your cluster, this is your stratum. And then the actual weight that you will use in your analysis is this one here, FOVWT2. It's F because that's MCS6. If it was MCS5, it would be E, MCS1 would be A, and so on. So it's A, B, C, D, E, F. So F just shows that that's MCS6. And that's the overall weight that we create when we deposit the data. And it's the product of the sampling weight and the attrition weight. And it's really important that when you're conducting analysis and you do want to make inference regarding the whole population, that you make sure to account for this oversampling and attrition. But it's very straightforward to do, and that's an example of how you would do it. And this NH2, finite population coefficient, that's just an adjustment for the fact that we have sampled a very large proportion of the population. So that's something that needs to be applied as well. In terms of some research examples of what's been done looking at ethnicity in the sweep, I thought in the study, I thought I'd just present one or two examples. So there was a paper around 13 years ago looking at ethnic differences in gestation and birth weight in England, an important topic given we know its association with sort of later cognition and social outcomes. And the authors found that even after controlling for background characteristics and compositional differences across different groups, there remain unexplained differences in both gestation and birth weight outcomes across broad ethnic groups that they looked at. So for instance, Asian babies are around 6 percentage points more likely to be of low birth weight compared to white babies. And black babies were around 5 percentage points more likely to be of low birth weight than white babies. So these are pretty large differences and potentially important to look at how these are associated with later outcomes for these children and how that varies across ethnic groups. The authors also looked at the sort of factors that have a positive impact on children's birth weight and a negative impact on the incidence of low weight babies. And they found that, as has been found in other research, factors such as parental height and health condition of the mother, smoking practices during pregnancy, mother's own obesity or overweight status, multiple births, and having a high parental educational qualification, these tend to be protective factors. And the authors found there was a considerable variation in these factors across ethnic groups, and these did explain some, but not all, of the observed differences in birth weight. There's been more recent research done by my colleagues Sam Parsons and Lucinda Platt, looking at the age 14 data, and in particular we asked questions around university expectation and how likely it is that they might go to university. And what this figure shows is that the average expectations of going on to university were lowest among white teenagers, so for about 63% of boys and 68% of girls. And boys and girls from all minority ethnic groups were significantly more likely to think that they will go to university compared to their white peers. And the average expectation were highest at 85% for Indian heritage girls. So strong differences there in kind of likelihood of going to university by ethnic group. And I think it will be interesting to see how these translate into actual university attendance in a few years' time when we have data on that. They also looked at whether or not the cohort members aspired to a professional or managerial occupation. So what they found was that around 1 in 3 of the teenagers had aspirations for a professional or managerial occupation. They found that rates were significantly higher amongst teenage girls at 38% than amongst boys at 29%. And they did find some differences by ethnicity, and these were significantly higher amongst Pakistani and Bangladeshi and black girls compared to the majority of white teenagers. And I'm sorry, the legend seems to have disappeared on that, but it will be the same as the previous slide. So evidence of ethnic differences in terms of their aspirations for particular job types. They also looked at the average hourly wage. So they mapped on data from the labour force survey and looked at the average hourly wage of the types of jobs that different teenagers were aspiring to. And what they found was that what ethnicity was not significantly associated with how male or female dominated a job was, but ethnic minority girls in general wanted to work in jobs that were on average higher paying than those that were aspired to by their white counterparts. And amongst boys, it was only black boys, we can see that by the red line there, who had significantly higher earning aspirations. So I think fairly striking findings there in terms of how they differ by ethnic background. And finally, they also just did some regression modeling, and they looked at, can these differences be explained by other characteristics? So the fact that maybe they're coming from different backgrounds and so on. And they found that, even when you account for different background characteristics, for instance, it was still the case that ethnic minority groups were more likely to want to aspire to go to university and more likely to aspire to higher wages. So that's research has just recently been published, and yeah, I think definitely worth a look. There's some very interesting results there. Just to point you to our website at the Centre for Longitudinal Studies, where you will find all 4 studies that we cover. And this is the Millennium Cohort Study kind of homepage. It's known as Child of the New Century to the cohort members and participants. And you can see that each study page features lots of information around the study sweeps, latest news, recent publications, documentation, and so on. So you can access questionnaires from our website and search for any questions that you might be interested in. You can find those within the questionnaires. In terms of accessing the data via the UKDS, so the Millennium Cohort Study and Understanding Society datasets that we've spoken about today and other data are freely available to researchers, government analysts and third sector from the UKDS website, which is given there, ukdataservice.ac.uk. And here's a screenshot of the website. There's the serial number for the MCS data and the serial number for the Understanding Society data are given there. And what's required is in order to download the data, you would need to create an account. You'd need to log in and register the project and state briefly the purpose of the project. Then you would find the data sets you want to use. You would agree to data security and other policies, and then you would download the data and supporting documents. And you can do that, download the data either in SPSS or Stata. Yeah, so it's very straightforward and doesn't take long, and yeah, it's easy to do if you follow those steps. Okay, and finally, just a slide showing some other sources of support around training and user support are listed on this slide here. So thank you for listening.